Welcome to another episode of the Cocoa Podcast, a place where we amplify voices in the chocolate and cocoa industry in search for true sustainability. I am your host, Emma Rose.
And I'm your co-host, Ines Kervarek.
And today we're going to dive into the world of chocolate with a very special guest.
Dr. Kristy Leissle is a scholar of cocoa and chocolate and a co-founder of the Cocoapreneurship Institute of Ghana. Since 2004, her work has investigated the politics, economics, and cultures of these industries, focusing on West African politics, political economy, and agriculture, specialty cocoa trades, and the complex meanings produced and consumed through chocolate's marketing and advertising. Her book, Cocoa, explores cocoa geopolitics and personal politics. She is the author of the series I'm a Cocoa Farmer, published by ConfectioneryNews, which offers in-depth profiles of people who farm cocoa for a living in Africa.
Well, welcome, Kristy.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be talking to both of you today, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, great to have you here. So yeah, might as well just get started with, how did you make chocolate such a central part of your life?
Oh gosh. Well, chocolate itself, the food, has always been a part of my life since my memories began, really. As a child, I really loved chocolate more than I loved anything else. And I would go to great lengths to eat as much chocolate as I could. So on a personal level, chocolate is like literally one of my earliest memories is of loving chocolate. So that's always been a part of me, but it wasn't until I was, in my PhD program, and I was actually already a few years into my PhD program, where I had been studying the water industry in West Africa. And I was planning to go and get started on my fieldwork in Senegal, looking at the privatization of water in Senegal when I had an opportunity to make a switch to chocolate. And so really, and obviously it was like no decision at all to change from studying water to studying chocolate. I'd never conceived of studying chocolate academically. This was like early days in food studies, so food studies wasn't something I was aware of as an academic. And so I hadn't really thought about studying chocolate. It would have almost sounded ridiculous, when I was applying to my PhD program to study chocolate. So the opportunity came my way. And then really, to be honest, like professionally, it has been like just never ending in its interest to me. Like I never get bored. I never lack for a new path. The field work is constantly interesting to me. And I just feel like even with as much as I've done, I've barely scratched the surface, and so there's no reason to stop, so there's plenty to be learned. And I'm just grateful to be able to make some field-based contributions.
That's fascinating. Nice. And let's see, the chocolate industry is very, very complex, and you've, researched many different aspects. If you were to kind of wrap it up into like a few short sentences, how would you, or maybe not, maybe a few paragraphs?
I'll try for sentences, because that's a great thing. And when I was a professor for most of my career at the University of Washington in Seattle and Bothell, and a lot of my exams, I loved to have my students write about a complex thing in one sentence. And so this is actually brings me right back to, I feel like I'm taking one of my own exams. So we'll see how well I would do. I would say that the value chain, right? The distance between cocoa and chocolate normally is very long, right? And not just long geographically, but economically and culturally. there's a lot of distance between cocoa and chocolate. And so to sum it up, I would say the most important thing that we can do, no matter where we are along that value chain, whether we're closer to the chocolate end or closer to the cocoa end or somewhere in between, is to like commit to learning as much as we can about the other parts of the value chain, right? And so I always really encourage my readers in my writing, people I'm speaking to at events, used to be my students as well in classes, to make a real effort to take the perspective of somebody else that does something different than they do in cocoa or chocolate. So if you're a consumer, try to take the perspective of a farmer. If you run a big company, try to take the perspective of someone who runs a small company. You know, whatever it is, try to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And that's one of the best ways I think we can to learn more about cocoa and chocolate.
I want to bounce back on this by pointing out that as complex as the industry is, we have to realize that it's very heterogeneous depending on where you are doing your work. So there is no one fits all answer to anything. It's always interesting to explore what other people are doing and see if it works or not, and then find the positive deviant and then try to apply it in other areas of the industry.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, what makes sense to one company or to one person or to one farmer or something might not work for someone else, right? There is no one right answer, and there is no one story that we can tell about how to do things in the best possible way, whether that means, you know, working for social justice or working for gender justice or even the luxuriousness of chocolate itself to increase our appreciation of it. There's always multiple ways that we can go about doing that, always. It's a great point.
Yeah. I have a question about how you do your research. So you go on the field and then approach people. How do you get in touch with them, first of all? How do you network there? And then how do you bond with them so that you know they will be truthful in their answers with you and really be able to allow you to dig deeper and see what they need, I guess?
Thank you for that question. You know, and my answer to that has changed somewhat in recent years, but to start out, I will say that you really can't ever just meet a farmer, you know. So most of my field research is with farmers, and you know, to start out, I'll say maybe this is different in other places, I don't know, but in Africa for sure, you can't just go up to a farmer and begin a conversation. You know, like farmers are human beings, you know, they have lives and families and work days and homes and stuff. And so really the way that I get in touch with farmers initially has always been through an organization or a company. And so typically in my case, it's a company. I would, in my earliest days as a researcher, got to know some of the managers of two different licensed buying companies in Ghana that are the ones who actually send representatives to buy the cocoa beans from the farmers. And so the licensed buying companies here, they do the actual trade with the farmers. And so they have relationships with farmers. So I made my research proposal, you know, to two of these companies, and they wanted to get to know me a little bit and my work and establish some trust with me. Once we had that established, then they would bring me into the field and introduce me to farmers myself. And so that is pretty much the way that I do it, and that stayed consistent over the years. My first introduction is always through a company or a cooperative or an organization where I will approach someone at the management level, get to know them a little bit, answer any questions they have about my research purpose, and then I get my introductions to cocoa farmers themselves. nowadays, because I live in Ghana, and I live in the capital city, Accra, so I don't live in a rural area, but I am able to go into rural areas whenever I want to. So now that I've gotten to know some farmers, I have the opportunity to contact them directly, and I might just message someone I know who farms cocoa and say, hey, what do you have going on this week? Do you want to meet up and talk about this or that? Or maybe we have some project we're working on, and then I'll go do that. So my individual relationships with farmers have been really helped by the fact that I live here, and it's very easy for me to go into the rural areas. So it's I wouldn't say it's an easy task to begin with, but once you get to know people, the way is paved.
Of course. Are the farmers in contact with each other, or they're usually more isolated?
Oh, no. They are absolutely in contact with each other. That's a great question, because and from your question, I'm reminded that sometimes there is this imagination that cocoa farmers are kind of stuck out in the middle of nowhere, and they have no contact with the outside world. And that's not at all true in my experience. But I think it's very easy to imagine that they might be, because of the stories we hear about farmers, that they're kind of cut off from globalization, or they're exploited by traders because they don't know anything. They live in the forest or something. In my experience, that's not at all the case. Some farmers live in more remote areas than others. That's just a fact. There are farmers that it's taken me a couple of days to get there from Accra, and that's because they're in a pretty remote region, maybe not very well served by regular transportation. There's some farmers that live right outside the capital, so they're coming here, they're coming into a big city. Every farmer has relationships with other farmers. How many relationships and how close they are really depends on what their village is like. And so some villages are really clustered. Like if there's, for example, like a main road or a paved road running through a village or nearby, the houses tend to be clustered around it, so that because that's your access, right? So people have built houses near roads or near streams. If there's a water source, the village might be a little more concentrated. And then you have farmers who all see each other all the time regularly. Some are a little more spread out, but you can't really grow stuff without talking to your neighbors. People talk to each other, they collaborate on things. Cocoa is super collaborative in many ways. Neighbors come together to help each other with certain steps. They share information, they share strategy, they talk about the weather, they talk about price. So they tend to be pretty communicative and pretty aware of what's going on, at least in their community, if not at the national level.
Okay. So I learned that farmers in Ghana were mostly grouped in co-ops, and that's where the cocoa then goes out to the world, right?
There's a few steps in between, but
okay.
Yeah, there's a little. It's a little bit more organized here in Ghana. But go on, finish your question, and then we'll
yeah, no, I just wanted to know how much they know about all of the different variables that affect their beans flavor and the future chocolate, I guess. So like all of the fermentation from growing the cocoa to fermentation and drying.
In Ghana, they know a lot. In Ghana, the cocoa farmers have been organized. Cocoa's been in this country for like 140 years or something. It's like farmers have pretty much always been organized. And maybe the way that organization looks, it might have changed a little bit, but and you use the word cooperative. There have always been cooperatives here. at certain periods of history, those cooperatives have functioned more cooperatively or less cooperatively, but there's always been a certain level of organization amongst cocoa farmers. And like at certain times in Ghana's history, for sure, the level of organization has been very high and sometimes less so. Just depends on the politics and the economics of the time period. So I would say now, yes, most farmers are organized into cooperatives or some kind of producer organization. Even before there was, even if farmers aren't organized as a co-op, they make selling decisions together. And so in Ghana, the official estimate is like 800,000 farmers, right? It's not possible for any company to have relationships with thousands and thousands of farmers, right? So the way it works is that farmers in a village or even a few villages will come together and decide, okay, all right, if there's only one company buying cocoa from them, they don't have a choice. But if there's a few different companies operating in their area, and there's usually a choice of who you get to sell to, then the farmers will decide together, okay, we're going to sell to this company. And so they're already organized at that level. Companies that you sell to, your actual beans, who pay you for them, tend to provide some help to farmers. And then, of course, there's also Ghana Cocoa Board, which is the regulatory body. It's a government agency that's tasked with regulating cocoa in Ghana. And of all of the big cocoa growing countries in the world, Ghana Cocoa Board does, let's say, the best job at regulating the industry. And part of that means training farmers on best practices. It means helping farmers to understand what has to happen between literally planting the tree and selling the beans to make the cocoa be its best quality. So Ghana has the highest quality of all the bulk beans that are traded in the world. Bulk meaning the conventional cocoa that goes into the major brands and the confectionery industry globally. So everything from like ice creams and cakes and whatever, all that stuff, right? So Ghana has the highest quality. Why? Because everyone's done a really good job at like explaining what are the best practices. Now, I'm not saying that every single farmer in Ghana does all of the things perfectly. That's far from the case, right? But you tend to see a really high level of knowledge and also a really high commitment level to doing the best that a farmer can. And the reason for that, in my experience, is that people have a lot of pride in what they do. Like, if you go into the bush here, you will hear someone say, Ghana is cocoa and cocoa is Ghana, right? That is a saying that's really common. And what does it mean? It means like, this cocoa built this country, and this country built cocoa, right? And so you have really people who are very aware of the need to do cocoa well and who do their best at it. So in my experience, people try their best and they have a high level of knowledge.
Wow.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, this is awesome. So what would be the farmer's relationship to the tree itself, I would say, because we hear a lot about how cocoa is not the best sustainable or money-making crop. So they're not interested in changing crops, are they? And how do they react to prolific hybrids that may be introduced to them?
There are farmers who would want to change. And when they want to change to another crop besides cocoa, the reason is because the cocoa is not working for them. And so there are always diseases, right? And so if a farmer lives in an area where disease or drought or some unknown thing, the farmers don't always exactly know what might make their cocoa not thrive. If a farmer is in a place where their cocoa is suffering, they might say, I'd like to grow something else. And I know farmers who live in parts, especially like the central region or western region in Ghana, where there's a lot of cocoa diseases, and they are struggling enough that they are trying, they'd like to switch to some other crop. In my experience, and again, it totally depends on like where you do your field work and which farmers but in my experience, that's not very common. It's much more common for farmers to want to stick with cocoa if they have it, or plant it if they don't have it. So cocoa is, you're absolutely right in that farmers, the people doing the everyday work of cocoa farming, don't often make a lot of money. That we can say for sure. But it's still the best option among many options if you're going to have an agricultural livelihood. There's not much industry here. Like Ghana's not like super industrialized. So options for work can be really limited. And if you've got a cocoa farm, then you have something durable. You've got something that's going to last you hopefully a long time, and something you can pass on to your children. So having cocoa is very highly valued. It's wealth. It's something that people strive to do, is work in cocoa. Once you're established as a cocoa farmer, farmers express a lot of satisfaction with that. They're happy for it. So yes, they don't necessarily make a lot of money, but in the context that we're in here, it's really a good thing to be doing. So it's both sides of the story are true. Are most cocoa farmers poor? Yes. Are they also really glad to be farming cocoa? Yes, because what are the alternatives? So it's sort of multiple takes on the situation that don't always get discussed.
Mm-hmm. So earlier you mentioned that they were pretty organized and they do have some kind of power in their trading the beans, in the way they trade the beans. How can we empower them more? Give them more voice, I would say.
I don't think it's for people outside to necessarily give farmers a voice, right? Like I think that, and I say that as someone who writes about farmers and actually tries to share their stories. So maybe in a way that's like, I don't know, that sounds a little bit contradictory, because my whole professional work is trying to bring farmers' voices, into more, to wider audiences. But I think that farmers are very capable of speaking for themselves, and if you ask, okay, so many times over the years, I've asked farmers this exact question, like, who has power in this industry? And I haven't analyzed this, so I'm making a very rough guess here, like just thinking anecdotally in my head. I would say about at least 25% of the time, the farmer will answer, the farmers have the most power, And so, okay, 25% may be kind of low, but some farmers really do say, I have the most power because I'm the one growing the cocoa. And if I don't grow cocoa, then the rest of this industry has nothing, right? And so there is awareness that farmers are the source of everything. Even those same people, however, who say, I have the power in the industry, those same people might even say, I still want to be respected, right? And I think farmers that I have talked to in Ghana over these many years are really aware that the rest of the industry does not respect them, and that they are seen as kind of less important than they are. And so, empowering farmers, that's a tricky one, because I don't know how you empower from outside, but respecting farmers, we can all do that, right? We can all do it. And for me, how do you respect a farmer is I ask them to tell me their stories, and I believe them, and I pay them the respect of believing their truth, right? Even if that truth sounds different to what I've learned somewhere else, or even if that truth seems to be in conflict with someone else, something else that I've learned. For me, respecting them means believing them and listening to them.
And when you move up the supply chain just a little bit, you get cocoa traders, right? Is that the next step? Like once the cocoa gets, and how, because, that is a thing that I've heard, is that farmers really don't have a say in the price of the cocoa, and it's the step above that does. So how does that system work?
In Ghana, it works differently than in Ivory Coast. So in Ghana, the price is set by Ghana Cocoa Board, and that's the price. And you as a licensed buyer, you have to pay that price. Having said that, there is always what we call weighing corruption, which is at the moment of sale, the farmer may not get the full weight of their beans. And there's lots of reasons for that. Like, people who buy cocoa they're human beings, right? So like, some are in a good position themselves, they're doing well, they have a good scale, they have, they belong to maybe a strong producer organization or a cooperative or something. They don't cheat the farmers as much. Other people are not so reliable, right? And may pay the farmer they'll still pay the price, but they pay for less cocoa than they're actually getting. And we call that weighing corruption. The word corruption is, again, like, sometimes I would say that it applies, and sometimes I would say it's almost more like a tax. And you will hear people in the industry describe it sometimes as a tax. So if the buyer or the buying organization takes 2 kilograms, or even the warehouse where the cocoa was stored might take 2 kilograms of cocoa or something like that from a bag, this like sort of tax is trying to pay everybody else that work, and I think one of the things that I really need to emphasize is that I'm not sure what sort of happens in people's minds when they think about that moment when cocoa farmers sell. Like, the stories I read suggest to me that there's this idea that there's like a farmer who's alone, and like there's a sort of evil trader who comes in and like exploits them and pays them like a penny, and then like they're alone in the woods or something. That's not the way it happens. Like, there's many people around, there's lots of people, and like the people who drive the trucks are there. There's lots of people from the buying organization who are milling around. There's neighbors, there's spouses, like there's children and aunts and uncles. I mean, everyone is around. So it's not like people are sort of, it's not like the poor helpless farmer going up against this big machine. And there's so many people required to move cocoa from a farm to ultimately a port or a factory, that this sort of tax that happens is supporting all those people. So it's not like, is the farmer losing out in a way? Yes. I believe, however, that when this happens, more often than people being bad, it's like the system is not like I just filed my taxes for the US, right? Like, I pay my taxes in America. And I filled out these forms, and I pay my Social Security, and I paid my Medicare, like taxes, and I pay all these things. And I have faith that the system is set up to do something for everybody, like build roads, or, pay retirement benefits, or make sure people have medical care, or whatever. That is not the way it works here. And so like, how do you make sure that people are taken care of when the system isn't formal? You tax the cocoa. So that happens, right? It happens, and it happens pretty regularly, and everyone kind of knows it, and people are more or less upset about it depending on their personal circumstances. But it's like not caused by people being bad usually. It's not caused by like evil. It's caused by the system, and the way the system is set up. So farmers may be relatively less powerful in some scenarios. Sometimes they may have more power.
Would you say that the farmers and the people along the supply chain make enough money?
No, definitely not. And this is why you see this kind of tax happening. Volumes matter. So if you are someone who's in charge of buying cocoa or warehousing cocoa or doing something between farm and port, and you've got a lot of volume coming through, that's a possible way to get more money, right?
Right.
If you don't have a lot of volumes, then you're not doing well. But overall, you don't become wealthy as a nation by trading agricultural commodities. Not in our world. If we can imagine another world where we valued things properly, what is more important than the food that we eat and the clothes that we wear and the things we build our shelter from? So in another world, we would value these things in a correct way. We don't do that. So the price of cocoa, and not just like the price that the farmer gets, but the whole price is low. And that price, like I said before, it doesn't just have to sustain a farmer. It has to sustain the nation of Ghana, right? Like, or Ivory Coast or whatever, right? It's like the cocoa is what's building roads and hospitals and, making sure the ports work and like all the things that we need as a people to live in a comfortable way. To making sure industry operates, utilities, lights, everything. Right. If you're trying to do all of that on a cheap agricultural good, you don't get very far. And so everyone along the value chain suffers from that because there's not too many moments where you can really get comfortable from your income from cocoa, no matter who you are.
If the global like cocoa prices, or maybe the ones in Ghana decided by the board, were to rise, I don't know how significantly it would have to rise, but would it be the people in the supply chain that would benefit?
Many would benefit. There's any industry has its problems, from the top to the bottom, so I can't say that if we raise the price of cocoa, say like overnight, if the industry magically decided to double or triple the cocoa price, would all of that go back to the farmers? No, some of it legitimately, right? Like legitimately, many other people have to make a living from cocoa, right? Whether they're transporting it, whether they're doing the administration of it, whether they're working at the port, whatever it is, lots of other people. So the idea that 100% of the value of cocoa can be passed on to a farmer is, to me, not a sound economic way of thinking, because it's not like the cocoa just magically jumps, from the farm right to the factory. It's got to get there some way. Would there be issues with illegitimate use of those funds? No doubt. That's the way the world works. That's the way industry works everywhere. And it's not exclusive to cocoa. It's not exclusive to any one country. The issue of wealth disparity, is not going to be solved just by raising the price of cocoa. And so that's something that I think, it's not like I'm going to be defeatist and say, okay, let's just accept it. But it's a reality that we have to at least acknowledge, while we're in the discussion of price, for sure.
Right.
I have a question about, so yes, we need money, but they probably also need more or better infrastructure, like roads and stuff like this. Who is in charge of that?
A great question. In any country, you'd expect the government to be in charge of that. And even here in Ghana, in Ivory Coast, in Nigeria, in Cameroon, you know, and all the big cocoa producing countries in Africa, the government has first and foremost the responsibility for infrastructure. You know, that's what governments do, is their job is to look after the population. The population needs roads, they need hospitals, they need electricity, they need clean water. This is our government responsibility. The reality is that in the case of Ghana, where I live, and I'm sure other countries in Africa that where I haven't studied it as carefully, the reality is that private sector sometimes does step in, and not always for the reasons that we think. If an industry needs to move something out of the country to generate its revenue, then they will make sure there is a way to do that. So in Ghana, what's happened historically is like the logging industry, you know, which takes out the trees, for the timber trees. That industry is not so much, okay, it still exists in Ghana for sure, but it's much less now because a lot of the big trees are gone. But when it was very strong and doing a lot of timber harvesting, the timber industry would tend to go in first. You cannot, like, trees grow in forests and there's no roads, you know, so the timber industry would somehow create a road, not maybe a great road, but a road, or repair roads that were not good. And then what you would often see is that cocoa would follow, right? And so a timber industry person would come in and sort of create a road or improve a road. And then people would move in and establish cocoa farms kind of behind timber. So that's just one example, right, of like how private sector can sometimes also provide these things, and not necessarily for what we'd consider like, it's not like a social justice project, you know, for the timber industry to go in and create a road. It's necessary for their own industry. But primarily, it is the responsibility of the government, and that's where really the money should go. Farmers talk about this quite freely with me, you know, and they understand that the government taxes their cocoa at the national level. Like they understand that the government sets a producer price that is minused out a tax, you know, and they will say to me, where did that money go? They say, we know it's supposed to come back to us in the form of development, you know, building roads, making sure there's clean water, making sure there's sanitation. And they don't necessarily see that cocoa tax money being put to a purpose that serves them developmentally. Some do, some don't.
How about programs from big companies? When you do research on big companies, like, not necessarily good ones, they talk about big projects they want to implement in West Africa to make a better living for the farmers. What's their reaction to these programs, and are they involved in what kind of program is going to be implemented?
Definitely. I mean, the big chocolate companies, you know, especially nowadays, I don't know so much what they were doing 10, 15, 20 years ago. Nowadays, the big companies do a lot of, you know, support for cocoa farming communities. And okay, they're not going to be building roads. They're not going to take on infrastructure projects that should really properly be the you know, the responsibility of a government. But the kind of programs that large chocolate companies sponsor tend to be really targeted to what cocoa farmers need, and again, it's really not a black and white issue here. I think what do most farmers want to grow more cocoa, like that's because more cocoa means more money. Big chocolate companies also want farmers to grow more cocoa, right? That's in their best interest, because the more cocoa you have, the cheaper it is, and the more security the big companies have for their main input. So everyone's aligned there, like farmers want more cocoa, big companies want more cocoa. That's a really strong alignment between the two. So the programs that companies tend to support are ones that help that, and it could be, sponsoring seedlings, high yielding seedlings that are given to cocoa farmers. It could be providing agricultural inputs, including, pesticides or fungicides or fertilizers. It could be providing the tools that farmers need. Like every farmer needs a cutlass, or multiple cutlasses. That, like, in some places it would be called a machete. Here it's called a cutlass. That's the basic tool of farming. Like you cannot do farming without it. Boots, like all stuff that you'd need to kind of work on a farm. So I have often seen companies supporting those very things. That's not usually what people necessarily want to hear when they're talking about like social justice or environmental justice, trade justice. Those tend to be the kind of the desires there, I think, are more like equity related, like how can like gender equity, for example, I think there's a desire sort of on the consumer end of things for there to be gender programs, for there to be child labor programs, the kind of social justice stuff, which obviously is important and just as important, if not more so, than anything else. It's not necessarily the case that farmers would collectively advocate for those things, because that doesn't necessarily help them grow more cocoa, so it's not, there's a lot of variety in what companies will sponsor. And I would say we need to be aware that some of those things do fall into a social justice category, and some fall into like a let's help farmers grow more cocoa category. And depending on what position you are in the value chain, you might say one is more important than another. Or not more important, more urgent, right? More urgent than another. So it's a mix. It's a real mix. Me personally, I tend to sort of support any program, like I don't like to say one program is better than another, because there's need for all of them, right? Like I will never say that like yields aren't important, because every farmer I've ever met wants to grow more cocoa, regardless of anything. I will also never say that gender justice is not important. To me, they're all important. And so if a company is doing one, I'm not going to say you're doing a bad thing by not doing the other. You kind of any help is not any help like indiscriminate, like let's pour a bunch of fertilizer and pesticides onto cocoa, that obviously isn't great. But like I would say most help is actually helpful from someone's point of view.
And how do direct trade relationships work as far as like cocoa or chocolate makers and cocoa farmers working together to, like, I guess, support each other's success? Does that have to go through, like, because I know often, when there is that relationship, the chocolate or the cocoa buyers will pay a premium for the beans that they're getting. And does that go through any like system before, or is that really like an equal trade?
No. There's always a system, right? And I think direct trade, again, in concept, I support it. I think the philosophy behind it is really important, and we, it pushes us to think differently about trade. But again, the reality of the system is that most of what is called direct trade doesn't really look direct if you follow the cocoa through, because again, there's no like way to get cocoa from a farm to a buyer or to a consumer directly. It's there are limited options, extremely limited options for trading without a lot of people in the middle, right? And so in Ghana, that's Ghana Cocoa Board, which controls all the export. That's Cocoa Marketing Company, who actually sell, do the actual contracts and agree the pricing for the cocoa. There's the agricultural extension people who are helping the farmers do the work well. There's the licensed buying companies. I mean, there's everyone providing like domestic labor, like around the cocoa industry. And that's not just like in the home, that's like everyone along the supply chain needs to eat. And if they're not in their own home, then they have to rely on other people for that. So like direct trade is not super direct in my experience, for the most part. So yes, direct trade contracts come with a premium attached. I don't know of any direct trade contracts that don't have a premium attached to them. But that premium doesn't mean the price of the cocoa changes. Like the premium has to fund many things. One of the things a premium often funds is a bonus to farmers. Like they will get a bonus at a certain point in the year based on the cocoa that they've sold for export. But the premium has to fund a lot of other stuff too, so even what people would think of as like, I'm paying extra for this chocolate bar because I want to support farmers. Yes, you are supporting farmers, but that money has to pay for lots of other stuff too. That's totally legitimate. It's like, you cannot pay a bonus to farmers without someone administrating that system. And that person needs a computer, and they need Excel workbooks, and they need training on how to use them, and they need internet, and they need pen and paper, and they need a physical place for farmers to come and distribute that money. Like it's huge amounts of admin. And like something has to pay for that, right? Because it doesn't just spring into existence. And so yes, direct trade is pushing us to think in better ways around our relationship with cocoa or anything. But it's not a magical thing, it's not like instantaneously all the farmers are suddenly doing much better than they were before. Right. They're getting some benefit. Maybe sometimes they're getting a lot of benefit. But in my experience, there's not like a sudden jump to a new socioeconomic level.
Right.
Are there any Ghanaian chocolatiers?
Oh, many. Yeah. And especially in the last, like, so let's say 5 years or so, lots of artisan chocolate companies have come into existence, and it's a thriving industry here in Ghana, very dynamic. Pretty much every day I feel like I hear about somebody new, who's making something from cocoa here in Ghana. So it's great. It's really exciting. And my NGO, the NGO that I co-founded with Mutia Merhab, the Cocoapreneurship Institute of Ghana, we work a lot with the artisan chocolate makers and confectioners and cocoa processors here in Ghana. So it's very exciting.
That is really cool, because you're keeping more value, I guess, in the chain in the country, right? When you make
in some cases all of it, right? Because most of the local chocolate companies or cocoa processing companies or whatever sell locally, right? And so there's a few who export, but most of the time I would say all of the value stays in Ghana.
Okay, nice.
Yeah, it's great. It's really nice. very, very small scale still compared to the amount that's exported, right? But
Right.
still, it's happening, and it's very exciting and very, very good products. Really world-class stuff.
I'll have to try some sometime.
Yeah.
I think one of my favorite bars of chocolate right now is from Ghana.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, I
Which
don't know.
one?
Mocha Origins is the company that makes them, and they have a
Yeah.
bar from Ghana, and it's a 72% dark, really good fudgy notes, really so good.
Very often that the Ghana chocolate, the Ghana cocoa presents those fudgy flavors, really like deep, deep chocolate flavors. Yeah.
I love it.
That's so nice. Oh,
Yeah.
good. I'm glad you're enjoying some Ghana cocoa.
Yeah. Let's see. I wanted to maybe ask if, like, from a consumer standpoint, I know you said earlier, the best thing you can do is really try to understand the other side of the supply chain. But what are the actions, like ways we can act or consume consciously this delicious food in a way that, helps everyone or, promotes sustainability in the industry?
That's such a great question, and thank you for asking that. My first reaction to that question is not to boycott anyone, not to make the assumption that cocoa coming from a certain place or from a certain company is automatically bad, right? Like in my experience, there's no evidence to support that, right? And we do hear calls in the industry to boycott multinational companies, to boycott West Africa, to boycott Ivory Coast, whatever. In my experience, that does more harm than it could ever possibly do good. Why? Because we're talking about human beings. We're not talking about evil, right? Like there is no evil in this industry,
Right.
There's people working really hard under really difficult circumstances. Sometimes they make good decisions, sometimes they make difficult decisions, but everyone's a person. And so for me, I would never cut anyone out because they live in a certain country or they look a certain way or they work for a certain company, right? Like, no. And now let me just emphasize that I know about cocoa. I don't know about other industries, right? And there may be other industries where a boycott would be the best option, but the supply chain would have to look very different, I think, for a boycott to truly be effective. Cocoa is an agricultural good. It is a smallholder crop, which means that like worldwide, there are millions and millions of cocoa farmers. To me, boycott doesn't make sense because whenever you're dealing with like millions of farmers, or even in one country's case, thousands or hundreds, that's too much variability for us to say blanket, they're all bad, So my first reaction is like, I've almost stopped saying like learn as much as you can, because I feel like there's so much information out there that just doesn't fit my experience. Like it just doesn't fit what I see in the field. That I almost want to say choose your information very wisely, and ask questions about the motivations behind that information, right? If your only information is a front page newspaper story in the Washington Post, someone has tried to sell you a newspaper, right? Like that is their goal, is to sell you, okay, not so much a physical newspaper anymore, but certainly the advertising that supports the newspaper. They're trying to sell you something, right? So what's the motivation behind printing that story? It's not because they want to tell you the whole truth about something. It's because they want to sell you something. Same with any chocolate bar, right? Like, why does anybody tell you something when they want, like if they're at a chocolate company? Because they want you to buy their thing. And so source information as smartly as you can. And at the same time, I would say, don't start with any assumptions. Like, don't presuppose that any one company is doing something wrong or that any one group of people is doing something wrong. Let's start with the premise that we're all human beings trying to make a living and keep ourselves fed and housed and safe, and doing the same for our loved ones, and then see what we can learn from there.
That was beautiful. That was a really awesome conversation, covered a lot, and I learned a lot. So thank you.
It was fantastic. Really, really. I mean, your questions were so fantastic, and it just gave me an opportunity to speak to some of the things I've seen and observed. And that I'm very appreciative of the way you've framed this and given me a chance to share some of the things I've seen.
That's great. Well, that's what this podcast is about. So that's awesome. Cool.
Fantastic.
Is there anything you think we didn't cover that you want to mention?
We did cover so much. I mean, I will say something I said, in just a slightly different way, which is that chocolate, why do we all care about chocolate? It's because we enjoy it, because we love it, because it gives us pleasure. Nowadays, okay, maybe people eat it for health reasons or something, but I think deep inside, most people are approaching chocolate as a pleasurable thing, right? Even if it has some health benefits as well. We like it, so let's not lose sight of that. Certainly farmers that I know would never turn down a piece of chocolate, right? Like, almost every time I sit down with a farmer or a farmer family or anyone in a farming business or cocoa business rather, usually I'll share chocolate, right? It's a sort of normal thing that I do, and everybody loves it, and like, people are so happy to be sharing this thing and to see people's faces light up, especially the kids. If I'm with a family and the kids are around and I get to share some chocolate with the kids, they love it, and so let's keep that in our hearts too, that like, and chocolate is joyful. It's a pleasure, and it's a pleasure for the people who grow it as well. The farmers aren't like, like, it's not like they're like, oh, I hate this thing that my cocoa is becoming. They're happy that they get to enjoy cocoa as chocolate, right? And so let's also remember that and allow ourselves to appreciate it, because I can tell you from a great deal of experience that farmers appreciate it too.
For sure. That's awesome. Cool. Well, thank you so much.
It was really inspiring for me. Loved it.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to hear that. I'm so glad. And I'm so grateful to both of you, for tackling this. I know it's a lot of work. I know that just like cocoa doesn't like magically move from a farm to a factory, like podcasts do not magically come into existence. And what listeners or viewers are hearing or seeing right now is like the tip of the iceberg, and both before and after, you have so much work that goes into this. So I thank you for taking on that work and doing it, for the reason of sharing more information and giving people access.
Our pleasure. Thank you for tuning in. This was the first episode of the Cocoa Podcast. We hope you enjoyed.